Welcome to Made for More, a podcast where we dive into all things faith, ministry, and everything in between. My hope is that through these conversations, you'll be reminded that you were made on purpose and for a purpose. Whether you're navigating your faith, leading in ministry, or just looking for encouragement in everyday life, this space is for you. With that in mind, let's jump into today's episode of Made for More. Thanks again for joining me. Today, we're going to be talking about just a simple question. And that simple question is like, why do I care so much about what others think? Maybe some other questions might be like, why does the approval of others hold such power over us? Why do we hesitate before speaking truth, adjusting our behavior to fit in, or replay conversations in our minds, wondering if we sound right? Why do we seek validation from people who are just as flawed, uncertain, and in need of grace as we are? See, these are questions we rarely stop to ask ourselves, yet I think it shapes so much of how we live. We spend our days carefully constructing an image, curating how others see us, and measuring our worth based on the reactions we receive. But deep down, we know this is exhausting. The fear of rejection, the pressure to conform, and the endless need to be liked. It all weighs on us in ways we might not even realize. But why does it matter so much? Why do we crave acceptance to the point that we shape our lives around it? Part of it comes from a deep-rooted need for belonging. We were created for community, designed by God to live in relationship with others. But sin has distorted that desire, turning a healthy longing for connection into a desperate pursuit of approval. Instead of seeking relationships that encourage us to follow God, we often find ourselves bending our convictions to fit in, fearing that standing out will lead to rejection. Yet, the irony is that no amount of human approval can ever truly satisfy us. We chase it relentlessly, but it never fills the void. And when we place people's opinions above God's truth, we end up sacrificing the very thing that leads to true peace, our unwavering faith in Him. Caring about what people think isn't inherently wrong. God created us for community, and it's natural to desire relationships built on trust and respect. But when the opinions of others begin to dictate our actions, when we start living for their validation instead of God's, we become enslaved to their expectations. What begins as a harmless desire to be liked quickly turns into an addiction to approval. It starts to define us, control us, and shape our choices in ways we don't even notice. And the worst part? It's never enough. The pursuit of approval is a moving target, constantly shifting, never fully attainable. One moment, we're celebrated. The next, we're criticized. People's standards change with time, culture, and personal preferences, meaning that what is praised today might be rejected tomorrow. And if our worth is tied to something so unstable, how can we ever feel secure? The truth is, we can't. Living for human validation means living in a constant state of anxiety, always striving, always fearful of falling short. It's a treadmill that never stops, exhausting us spiritually, mentally, and emotionally. But when we finally recognize the futility or the uselessness of this chase, we open the door to something far greater. Freedom in Christ, where our worth is no longer dictated by people's fleeting opinions, but by God's eternal truth. Paul addresses this tension directly in Colossians 2, warning the church not to be led astray by human traditions and empty philosophies. He says this in Colossians chapter 2, verse 8. He says, "Be careful that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deceit based on human tradition, based on the elements of the world, rather than Christ." See, the believers in Colossae were facing pressure to conform. Some were being told they had to follow certain religious customs to be truly saved. Others were likely tempted to soften their faith to blend into the culture around them. And Paul's message was clear. Don't let people dictate your faith. It's a simple yet profound truth. The pull to conform has always existed, whether through religious legalism or cultural expectations. But Paul makes it clear, Christ alone is the foundation. The world will always try to add conditions to our faith, convincing us that we need to be more or less of something to be accepted. But when we let human standards replace God's truth, we lose sight of what truly matters. This same warning applies to us today. Our world is full of voices telling us what to believe, how to live, and where to place our identity. Some demand that we water down our faith to be more tolerant or inclusive. Others create legalistic rules, measuring spirituality by human standards instead of God's grace. But Paul reminds us, Christ alone is our foundation. His voice is the one we should care about. His word is the one we should build our lives on. If we're not careful, we can be pulled in so many different directions that we end up prioritizing people's opinions over God's commands. And when that happens, we start to drift. Subtly at first, but eventually we find ourselves living a faith that is shaped more by the world than by Christ. There's a massive difference between living for the approval of people and living for the approval of God. The first is filled with striving, anxiety, and constant uncertainty. The second is filled with peace, security, and deep-rooted confidence. See, the approval of man is built on shifting sand. One wrong step, one unpopular opinion, and it's gone. But the approval of God is built on the rock of Christ. It's immovable and unchanging. When we live for people's validation, we are bound by an endless cycle of trying to prove ourselves. But when we live for God's approval, we experience a freedom that cannot be shaken. See, true freedom comes when we release the need to be liked and instead focus on being faithful. This doesn't mean we stop caring about people or their feelings, but it does mean we stop allowing their opinions to shape our identity. We begin to see ourselves through God's eyes, loved, chosen, and secure in Christ. We no longer need to perform, to prove ourselves, or to meet impossible expectations. Instead, we rest in the truth that God's love is unchanging. His approval is already ours through Jesus, and our worth isn't up for debate. That kind of security is what truly sets us free. If we are truly following Jesus, we will stand out. That's not a possibility. It's a guarantee. Jesus never called us to blend in. He called us to be salt and light in Matthew chapter 5. And light, by definition, is noticeable. It's different. It stands out. So why do we try so hard to dim our faith to make others comfortable? Why do we hesitate to speak truth, afraid of how we'll be perceived? The reality is, our faith is meant to be visible. It's meant to challenge the world. It's meant to be different. And that means sometimes, we will be misunderstood. Sometimes we're going to be criticized. Sometimes we're even going to lose relationships because of it. But that's part of what it means to follow Jesus. Standing firm in our faith requires us to be courageous. It means choosing obedience over popularity, truth over acceptance, and righteousness over convenience. It means understanding that our calling is not to fit into the world, but to reflect Christ in it. We will never be able to please everyone, nor should we even try. Our mission is not to win the approval of people, but to glorify God in everything that we do. And when we embrace that truth, when we truly live for His applause instead of the world's, we find a boldness that cannot be shaken. Because at the end of our lives, we will not stand before a crowd. We will stand before the King. And in that moment, the opinion of others will not matter. What will matter is whether we lived for him. So the next time we find ourselves hesitating, shrinking back, or even over-analyzing what people might think, let's ask ourselves, why do we care so much about what others think? And why aren't we caring more about what God thinks? Because at the end of the day, only one of those opinions carries eternal weight. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Made for More. My prayer is that today's conversation encouraged you, challenged you, and reminded you that God has created you with purpose and intention. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, share it with a friend, or leave a review. Until next time, remember, you were made for more. So live with purpose and trust God in the journey. See you next time.